Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on the occasion of the Biden-Putin Summit. The Graduate Institute is extremely pleased to welcome you and also pleased with the collaboration that we have for this event with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Good evening to all of those who are joining us from Asia, and also good morning to all those who are joining us from the Americas. We have a stellar panel for you today that are walking us through the context that frames the Biden-Putin Summit, and also that help us make sense of some of the expectations that are associated to the summit, and also what it really means for International Geneva. So I'm very glad to introduce the panel to us now. We have to my immediate left, we have Paul Vallet, who is a lecturer and researcher in European and American and Russian history, associate fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. We have Stephanie Hoffman, known to many of you, particularly all of those who are alumni, of course, from the Graduate Institute, professor in the Political Science Department. Thank you, Stephanie, for being here. We have Kazuko Kobayashi, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Graduate Institute Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding. And we have live from Washington, D.C., we have joining John Erath, who is a senior policy director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and also who is an executive in residence at the GCSP. So not possible to have any better lineup for us to make sense of this quite monumental event, which is preparing itself here in Geneva. For those of you who go around town, you see already a lot of barbed wire and also a lot of the preparations taking place to assure that the event takes place in all security and all order necessary. It's been not the first time, of course, that Geneva is a host to such an important meeting. And Paul, perhaps we can start the conversation with a little bit of a historic look back in some of the other summits that have shaped International Geneva, particularly between then it was the Soviet Union and the Americans. Why don't you help us make sense of this historical dimension?
Of course, thank you very much. As you pointed out, well, International Geneva was born in the late 19th century, and it, of course, really took off after 1920 when the League of Nations established its seat here. But this is a particular period in the history of International Geneva that expanded even after the Second World War. And indeed, Geneva, as of course a center located on neutral ground, was a place where the both sides of the Cold War could meet once they started speaking. And I think this is precisely one of the important issues about the forthcoming summit. It's the resumption of dialogue. The first, of course, we've been hearing in the last few days a lot of comparisons, especially with the summit of 1985 between President Ronald Reagan from the United States and the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who met here in Geneva for 2 days in November 1985. But we have also, of course, a previous summit that we sometimes don't think so much about because it's that of 1955. And this was the first major East-West summit, if you may call it that way, held in 7 years since the Cold War had broken out with the Berlin blockade. And for the first time since then, the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, so the four big victorious powers of the Second World War, met again in Geneva in 1955 to discuss mainly, of course, the issues that had arisen during the Cold War, that is, of course, the arms race, and in particular the German question. And even though that summit in 1955 did not end up with very concrete solutions, well, there was one throwback that was eventually the Open Skies Treaty that was first proposed by President Eisenhower at this Geneva summit. Well, at least if it did not yield that many instantaneous concrete results, what did happen was that the place of Geneva as a place of meeting on issues, especially of disarmament, was firmly established. And of course, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva continues that tradition to this very day. And of course, it then set the setting for the choice in 1985 for the two parties who had not met since the deterioration of East-West relations after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, to resume the dialogue in November. And so, of course, this was, some of us here were already alive at that time, and we remember the excitement and the coverage of this historic meeting. It had some throwbacks to the preparations that we've seen this week too, because it's often forgotten, because a lot of the attention is often focused on the grand meeting places and the great hotels in Geneva where a lot of the public events take place. But the private discussions were also conducted in a rather secluded locale at the time. So at the time was the Villa Fleur d'Eau in Versoix. And of course, today is going to be Villa Lagrange on the other side of the lake.
Well, here, this is also a very nice picture that, of course, the two sides of Geneva are collaborating on this rather monumental occasion, which is, of course, from a Geneva perspective, also a reminder that it's about all of Geneva. Yes. This is not just international Geneva. This event really puts Geneva on the map. And it's not just, in fact, Geneva that is part of the summit, historic summit diplomacy, but of course summit diplomacy happens in many other parts of the world. And as we have seen also, now there has been a series of summits that is, in fact, running up to the Geneva summit here. And perhaps, Stephanie, we can turn over to you just for you to give us perhaps an insight into some of the other summits that are associated to the run-up of the Biden-Putin summit here. There was the G7 just in the UK, there is the Brussels summit now. Give us perhaps, what is some of the flair that comes out of these summits, and also what are in fact, what's your view on this summit diplomateering in general?
Thank you for this question. So I think, let me just start with 2014, which I think will be a year that will pop up quite a few times in this discussion, where actually the relationship between the US and Russia deteriorated with the invasion of the Crimea, but not just the US and Russia, but also Europe and Russia as well. And before that, we had the G8, for example, so Russia was part of this format, and we also had, or we still have the format where Russia can talk to NATO allies, but that basically did not become anymore a forum where political discussions could take place. So now we had just the G7 summit. We are today just witnessing the NATO summit. Tomorrow, the US will meet with EU partners in the US-EU format. And so at least two of these occasions until 2014 would have been occasions where the US president could have met the Russian president, right? And so now these bilateral summits are becoming more important again just because Russia is not part of the G7. Again, in NATO, it doesn't have that many more access points where political discussions can take place. So now really what we see is that the Biden administration, President Biden had discussions with his counterparts in the G7, talking primarily about climate change and the pandemic and how to handle the pandemic. Today in Brussels, in the NATO format, they're discussing a host of issues. At least what I followed on Twitter really already shows that China is coming up as an issue, Russia as well, but not every ally is seeing or interpreting the relationship to China and Russia in the same way. Similar topics, I think, will be all coming up again tomorrow with the discussions on the EU, maybe more from a trade and investment perspective as well. So, but I think here we really have these different multilateral settings where President Biden maybe gets some feedback from allies as well. I'm pretty sure the US has a firm position on what they want to bring to the agenda when coming to Geneva, but I can also imagine that some nuance will be brought in these different multilateral settings that then will maybe also feed into the discussions with President Putin.
Excellent. And I think as you alluded to, and also for you, ladies and gentlemen joining us online, we have a whole spectrum of issues in front of us that are coming out in all the different summits and all the different discussions. And it is really looking at global governance and global politics through the lens of the Biden-Putin summit is really a great occasion to make sense of the state of politics that we are currently facing. And this is why also I would like to invite you online to share your reflections and your questions to our panelists in the online chat, which we have monitored throughout the event, and which we also then bring in your questions at a later stage in this panel discussion. So a whole series of issues out there, a whole series of perspectives. Perhaps let's go both to Washington and also via Kasi, we go to Moscow to get a better understanding how different constituencies are viewing the summits as they are taking place, how they are viewing the kind of the understanding of what is negotiable, what is not negotiable. And perhaps, John, we can start with you from the DC space. How are people in Washington and analysts in Washington and constituents in Washington looking at the prospects of the summits that are in front of us?
Thank you very much. There is some anticipation of the Biden-Putin Summit here in Washington, but there is also some controversy. There are a number of people who have pointed out that Russia has not been behaving very well over the last few years. It has invaded its neighbors, it has interfered in their internal affairs, it has interfered in elections in the Americas and in Europe. It has suppressed dissent within its own country and cut back on freedom of expression and some of the things that are important to us. And these concerns are very important, and they will be raised in the context of the meeting of the presidents. But the fact remains that the reasons for a dialogue with Russia are also there, and they are very strong. And such a dialogue is way overdue. As Paul and Stephanie have previously stated, there's a long history of summits between the US and Russian leaders. There is important business that needs to get done in these meetings. For me, the most important thing is arms control, but there are many of these other issues as well. When Donald Trump was president, he very much wanted to meet with Putin. But his political advisors told him it's not a good idea to do that. It would be seen as rewarding Putin for bad behavior. And we don't want to do that, especially with an election coming up. So while the instinct for Donald Trump was to talk with Putin as a very important world leader, there was an overriding concern that it was more important to win the election and not to do anything controversial with the part of the electorate that supported him. So a Trump-Putin summit never happened. That means it's been way too long since we have had something like this. The reasons are still there. Yes, Putin needs to hear about human rights, about Ukraine, about his agents using chemical weapons in small English towns. And we're going to hear the normal list of complaints from Russia. Interference in Ukraine, support to enemies of the Russian state. But it is much more important to talk about the areas for cooperation. Arms control, terrorism, climate change, things like this. These are going to be what is featured on the agenda, and this will be the most important for discussion.
Thank you, and let me already make the link to what you said earlier, Paul. No? Geneva as a place for reconnecting and also as opening up channels of direct conversations again, and particularly after all the COVID remote summitteering, I think it's a great reminder that perhaps as a small seed of trust building can take place that is important then to advance agenda issues on the way forward, even acknowledging that there is a fair degree of differences among many issues. So thank you very much, John, for this view from Washington, D.C. Now, Kazu, may I turn to you? You have a very strong network in the Russian academic and intellectual sphere. What are your colleagues in Moscow saying about the summit? What are the views from Moscow?
Thank you very much, Achim. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I was talking to some of my colleagues from Moscow, and they told me that if you need to have a Japanese to represent the Russian view, this is already a deterioration of European relations. That was funny for me. But, well, I want to emphasize 3 points. Like John said right now, in the Trump time, it was already considered that having a summit with Russia was concession, that President Trump was criticized for Helsinki Summit, for instance. There was even this transcript scandal that was very fiercely criticized. So from the Russian side, I think this summit, the very fact that summit takes place is already seen as a sign of concession, that United States, after imposing rounds of sanctions, agrees to meet with Russia in Geneva. That is, I think, one point. But more importantly, the second point, I think, in many Russian circles, this is kind of seen as an attempt by the Western powers to divide and conquer China and Russia. That is a major perception that Western powers are trying to tear apart Russia and China. It's not that Russia and China are allied. There are many differences, many disputes, and many differences of opinions. But I think that in the strategic sense, it is seen more like an attempt to make sure that Russia will not be fully aligned with China. And that, I think, at least has a symbolic value in it. And lastly, I also want to emphasize that since I'm from Japan, Russia has been expanding its influence since 2014. And America is a hegemon, of course, the strongest power in the world. But America is also one of many countries that Russia has interaction with. Since 2014, in Russia's immediate neighborhood, Russia has strengthened relationship with major powers, India, South Korea, and Japan especially. India has become the largest importer of arms from Russia. South Korea launched a visa-free agreement of travel interactions in 2014. And Japan launched this 8-point plan to make Russia a great power of high-quality life. That's a very long title. In English, it just says 8-point plan. But in Japanese language, that's the official title. And since then, Japan has expanded its market in Russia. And so on top of these Asian powers, Russia has also developed much closer interaction with many other countries in the world of different cultures, religions, and races, such as Brazil and South Africa. So in that context, I think United States is very important for Russia. But from the Russian point of view, I think this is still one of the many partners or counterparts that Russia is interacting. And especially in the current environment of transformation of international politics, probably the weight of Europe is getting less for Russia, especially since 2014. Many Asian powers increased its influence in Russia, not only economically, but also politically, culturally. There are many events and, like human-to-human contacts in Russia for many different worlds. Before that, I think Russia was much more focused in a European theater. It was considered to be a European power, but thanks to the Western sanctions, Russia has diversified its relations. To what extent this will help Russia to, pursue its goals, I think it's still unclear. But I just want to emphasize the fact is that I think the world is becoming more globalized, and there are multiple poles of power, and Europe will be only one of it.
And excellent points there. And perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, let me perhaps say a few things of the panorama that we've just heard now. Which is the context. We have the context which we just heard from Kazu, where this bilateral relationship, US-Russia, is one of multiple relationships that Russia now has, particularly, as you point out, due to some of the need for reorienting its diplomacy and commercial relations to other places away from Europe due to the sanctions. We have a long history of conferencing here in Geneva and also of making connections between great powers, again, as Stephanie also said, on such a wide range of different topics that are in front of us, many of them divisive. And you have also different perspective and different political constituencies that want the summit to succeed or also not, some of them based in the United States, some based elsewhere. What a panorama to think about expectations of what can really come and result from this summit. And the discussion on the results, the expectations that we might put into this Biden-Putin summit, and this entire week of summit hearing that has shaped much of the global media these days, that is the next point of questions which I would like to get to. And here perhaps we go straight to John in Washington. What would be your hope as a result that comes from the Biden-Putin summit?
I think the result is that there will be a good discussion between the two presidents. It is, at this point, too optimistic to expect that there will be major breakthroughs. If you look at the history of US-Russia summits, even back in the Cold War, the meetings were more regular, but they rarely produced results. The process that led to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, for example, was begun in 1980. The treaty was not finished until 1987. So these big achievements take time. They need years of very careful, painstaking discussion among the experts from both sides. But it's good if the leaders were to start the process, not even of negotiations, but of the preliminary discussions that will lead to negotiations. So I'm not expecting a major achievement, but just the reestablishment of dialogues, if there is a plan for arms control experts to begin to meet regularly, probably in Geneva, but it does not matter where. But if something like this were to come out of it, I think that would be a very good result.
So arms control back on the agenda. Now, Stephanie, in the bigger peace and security sphere, what are some of the other expectations or results we could hope for?
Well, first of all, if I may, I think even if there might be results we will not hear from, right? Because these kind of summits don't really have a communique that's published afterwards. So there might be certain things that will be agreed upon that we will not find out, or that historians will find out when they go to the archives later. But that being said, I agree with John. I don't think there will be lots of substantive decisions being taken at this particular summit. But I do think that what we might find is discussions that have basically two purposes. One for domestic consumption in the US and in Russia, and another one really for more diplomatic encounters. And I think there we can expect some kind of declaratory remarks being made. For example, it was already briefly mentioned, sorry, I'm moving away from security for a second, but for example, the pandemic. And maybe there will be another declaration being made that Russia and the US are both willing to contribute to, I mean, the vaccine pledge has already been made at this G7. Maybe there's something else that will be declaratorily mentioned in this regard as well. Same with climate change. I think Biden has said he's a big fighter for fighting climate change. And Russia is maybe less so, but they will be holding the presidency of the Arctic Council, and maybe there again it's a chance to declare the willingness to fight climate change. And this, I think, is more for the international community. Like, we can work together on certain particular issues, and then certain issues such as cyber attacks that allegedly have been coming out of Russian territory, maybe with support from the Russian government, the sanctions regime that the Biden administration and the Trump administration before them, etc., have been imposing. I don't think we're going to see any major results there for domestic reasons, right? I do think that Biden already, he made the promise to be harsh, for example, on human rights issues, and so I don't think he's going to budge on this particular issue. And Putin will, as I think it has been mentioned before as well, will not budge on issues on Ukraine, for example. So here it will be much harder. Maybe small points that can be discussed as well are Syria, for example, the humanitarian corridor going into Syria. Here the mandate at the UN has to be renewed by July 10th, I think it is. And maybe the summit in Geneva is a chance for Biden to convince Russia to agree, or let's say not veto, so abstain from the vote when this mandate has to be prolonged.
Excellent. And I think it's a very good point. You refer to the time sequences of results. I think that's very important also to manage public expectations in the summit, because indeed we know from historians, and perhaps you can remind us about this sometimes, how long it takes to realize really that a summit is historic. The happening is historic, but then really what it achieves takes historians like you, Paul, to understand, to get to the gist of it. Now, Kazu, perhaps to you, on your expectations on results. What do you think, with a point of view from more the Asia space? What could be results that you think the summit could achieve?
Well, I think there won't be much result like everybody else is talking about right now. But more importantly, I think there's a structural problem that is the United States ready to have results, because in Asia, for instance, we used to make a lot of effort to make TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan has spent literally thousands of hours to negotiate this agreement to take into account America's interests. And then we see what happened, that when a country is polarized, when they speak with two voices, with two parties, with two different kind of worldviews, it is very difficult to come to agreements. So that's my point, that even if miraculously Russia and America agrees on some big things, there is a question, will that be implemented? So even if President Biden agrees on many huge things on Russian-American cooperation, when he goes back to Washington, what happens, I think, at the current political climate, this is very uncertain. I would just think that even if there is a huge miracle, that will be just like another TPP, that politics will be involved and can be revoked, and also because the Democratic Party is actively discussing if President Biden will continue as a president for the second term. There's already discussion internally about the future of the second administration or who will run for the president. So in that sense, I think from the Russian point of view, this is more like a transitional meeting, that there can be result, possibly, miraculously, but even if there's a such thing, there's no guarantee that that will be ratified and supported in Washington. And also after 3 years, what happened is very, very unclear. So I think from the Russian side, for now, the best strategy is to keep calm, and not to carry on, but to just stay on the track, to keep talking, but not to expect so much, and see if there will be something after 3 years to develop stable relationship. I think this is a key difference of dynamics between Russian-American relations and Russian-Chinese, Russian-Japanese relations. In Japan, we have the party in power for almost 70 years. When Russia talks to Japan, they can be sure that after 10 years, mostly the people will be in power. So that is why, also in China also, but that is why we can talk about 5, 10 years, 20 years even. But I think if we really want to stabilize international relations, that kind of stability is very important. At least to have that kind of stability is required. I think the United States had it in the Cold War time. So that's what I think about it. Even if there is huge outcomes, the implementation will be very, very uncertain in many ways.
Can I get you back in on the expectations? I mean, you have such a rich knowledge of historical of history. What do you think can be taken out of the summit?
Well, on the expectations, it might be an interesting way to look at it in what it might not be, especially in terms of historical analogies. And if I were to sum it up, I would say that the ambitions, and perhaps I'm speaking a little bit more from the American side, I'll be honest to our viewers on this, but seen from the US, it's probable that what the Geneva Summit is expected to be is not Yalta and not Helsinki. And I use these two analogies, well, in part because, well, obviously there should be no comparison between these past. Yalta in 1945 is, of course, in a completely different context, the end of the Second World War and the urgency for the Allied powers to make very swift decisions on post-war Europe and on the building of the United Nations system. And a lot of the concessions that were made by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to Joseph Stalin at Yalta, where we should remember, designed in order to get the USSR to participate in the UN system afterwards. But of course, the people in Central and Eastern Europe paid a very fearsome price out of that. And strangely enough, Yalta is again very often mentioned in current Russian literature right now. It's, I think, follows to a general trend in the current Russia to rehabilitate the Stalin regime, to exalt the geopolitical achievements that this regime brought about after 1945. And there's somewhat of a bit of a nostalgia around wanting to be able, again, to be reasoning on the same plan as the other great powers and to decide the fate of the rest of the world. And we're no longer in that kind of world. If we're truly believing in a multipolar and multilateral world, and even though the United States sometimes still acts unilaterally, we've seen it in recent years, the fact is, at least on the Western side, I think there's a much better comprehension of the limitations that have to be there. So from the US policymakers' point of view, they're not coming to Geneva to bargain about zones of influence in Europe or elsewhere. But as John has mentioned, I think there's going to be mainly a focus on the areas of practical cooperation. And not Helsinki, well, that's again a little bit, and I think that throws back to what Kazu was saying about the domestic context in the US, which is very important right now. But of course, it also explains what John was saying earlier about the fact that no big Trump-Putin summit happened after that date as well. But at least, for a lot of US viewers, the Helsinki summit, and particularly its press conference section, gave a bit of a cringing feeling because it was not so much an issue about the United States and Russia getting together and working together on these practical issues. It seemed to be much more like a connection between two personal leaders, and for the first time, the then occupant of the White House, you'll obviously see my reticence to give him the formal title he had at the time, but seeming to admire the way of governance of his interlocutor. And that is something that created a lot of suspicion politically and even around both parties, and of course has then raised a lot of questions throughout the whole mandate about what exactly was it that there was this Putin-Trump relationship that was then becoming problematic for, as John would probably say, it became problematic for all the resumption of the essential affairs that regarded both powers as well too. So I think it's also, of course, perhaps one thing, with all due respect to our Finnish friends, because we have many here at the GCSP, in the Maison de la Paix as well too, and at Helsinki, they obviously try to act in the way that Switzerland does as honest brokers in this matter. But I think, if Geneva got the summit this year, it was also, of course, in good part because the US party did not want to give the impression that they were going back to Helsinki, and they really wanted to move on and, as we said, to discuss real important issues on that matter.
Thank you, Paul. Also to reminding our viewers on when we are looking through through global politics, through the lens of the Biden-Putin Summit, we can in fact see how much the world has moved on from a relatively simplistic leaders' change view on global politics, that it's no longer about that two individuals are coming together in a city and deciding on the fate of the world. I think the connectivity of the world, also the multidimensionalities of foreign policies, that Kazu alluded to, and also the sheer number of policy issues on the table all attest to the fact how much global diplomacy has changed, global politics has changed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I promised you that we come to your questions that some of you are submitting online to us, and I've screened my phone where I have my colleagues who are sending more questions, and I paraphrase one question that was noted online, which goes around like, is this summit really about Russia and the US, or is it really about China? So which brings us perhaps, which is a nice entry point into discussion about changing geopolitics, but also about the big elephant in the room. Because if we're looking at all of this, the substance in the summits in the UK, if we're looking at the so-called Merkel-type pragmatism with respect to positioning Europe between the US and China, there is, and of course guarding its interest with respect to the Nord Stream pipeline and so forth, there was a lot of talk about the country not in the room. So how do we make sense of the China connection in all the discussions around the Putin-Biden summit? Is there any one of you, John in DC, anyone who wants to take a first crack at this?
Can try to answer if
Okay, John, yes, please, do come in.
No, I think of the summits that are going on this week, this one will be least about China, just because there are so many issues on the bilateral US-Russia relationship that will require discussion and that have been neglected for some time now. China will come up. There will be discussion of it, but it's not going to be the major or even one of the 5 or 6 most important subjects for this one.
Thank you, John. Yes, please, Paul.
I'll perhaps mention as well too. Of course, we're probably waiting for eventual news of a Xi Jinping Joe Biden summit. It may happen at some point. I don't know whether it will happen in Geneva as well too. But it's worth pointing out, just to as a reminder, this may be the first major US-Russia encounter of the Biden term, but we should remember that there's already been a high-level US-Chinese meeting in Anchorage a few months back. Well, we know it was also a little bit of a fresh meeting in which, not entirely dissimilarly to what we could expect this week in Geneva, there was a very frank and at times a little heated dialogue between the heads of diplomacy of the two states. So that's already considered, I think, it's already somewhat of a stage that the US and China have established in, setting the tone and perhaps the terms of their future dialogue on this matter. So just to point out that, the US-China relationship is obviously one thing. Of course, Mr. Putin has been to Beijing as well too, not that long ago as well too. So whether one day we might even see a tripartite format is an interesting question. But as I said, if the issue is to act more multilaterally and less in a sort of transform the word trilateral kind of way, that's probably the way it's going to go in the next few months or so.
Excellent. Let's see if Geneva can be a hosting area, a hosting place for that meeting as well. Excellent. Stephanie.
My 2 cents would have been very, very similar in the sense that I think that China might have been an issue. I mean, organizations like NATO, for example, were rather reluctant of talking about China until very, very recently. Now we see every meeting that Biden had attended before he's going to meet Putin, I think, will have had a substantial part of the discussion will have been on China, on various issues that we mentioned already. And but this particular bilateral summit, I think there's so many grievances that have been now piled up on one another, right? And talking about the cyber attacks, the treatment of human rights. I mean, we talk about Navalny, but we could also talk about Belarus and the implicit support that Putin has given to this regime, or not so implicit actually. The list goes on, and I mean, from the Russian side as well, there are many grievances that are not, where China doesn't really come in through the back door. These are US, Russian items on the agenda. So I do think that here really we have, or they have enough to cover and could spend many more days on whatever shore of the lake here to talk about if they would be so inclined.
Excellent. Kazu, just briefly to you. I mean, we've now already heard quite a lot about the European perspective and the American interest, of course, to woo Russia back into the slightly more European court, and of course the European positioning between China and the United States, or between the United States and the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, is there anything in Russia, what colleagues say, or from your experience, how important the rapprochement to the West is for Russia? Also given the importance of China within the Russian territory itself?
Well, there's a large portion, not maybe large, but there's some portion of Russian politicians and populations which truly and strongly believes that Russia is part of white Christian civilization. For that segment, China is not a good idea. That's what I heard from my colleagues, that there are strong nationalist, ultra-nationalist far-right elements in Russia that believes that Russia must be very strongly and exclusively anchored to Europe, which is the center of white European civilization, the Christian values, etc. So I think there's an element in that, but I think it is also important to consider the difference in strategic culture that I think in the Western countries, generally, for instance, Western military academy, etc., they have one strategy, grand strategy, you implement it. If there's something on the way, you just bomb it and go through it. But there's always one strategy. Coherence is thought as a strength. So if you want to be resilient, you have one strong strategy, coherent, and you take on it. But when it comes to Russia or also other non-Western countries, strategy is about having multiple plans, multiple contradictory plans. It's like I used to study in the economics department, and it's like a financial portfolio, you know. Resilience comes from contradiction, that you synthesize and package multiple contradictory elements to make up a whole package that is adaptive to changing situations. And I think when it comes to Russia-China relations, there are many different elements in that. At one element, Russia-China is getting much closer. Other elements, they have disputes. And these are not really like contradiction. It is package of strategies to make sure that Russia is adaptive to different situations. And in that sense, I think maybe Russia doesn't have one coherent, unified strategy, or Russia doesn't need one. That Russia actually thrives in contradictions, both politically, internally, and internationally, I think. Maybe same for Japan. That's why sometimes we understand each other, you know. We are both Western and non-Western at the same time. And that, I think, this kind of duality needs to be taken into account if we want to do a strategic analysis or analysis of foreign policy. That we cannot just assume that there's kind of divine coherence of things, of order, of unity, of homogeneity. That, I think, is probably from different age. And nowadays, I think it is very much complicated.
And this is, I think, a very important reminder to all of us joining us from wherever you are in Asia, Europe, or the Americas, that foreign policy is not always this grand strategy, that there are, as you rightly say, these multiple contradicting policies in the hope that one might work as part of a resilience strategy. And this is particular for those who are studying foreign policy, particularly if we're looking at Russia's policies towards Syria, to some of the other conflict zones, one can see strains of this policy, you rightly say. So all the more complexity surrounding, of course, a summit that tries to relate a relationship back into a somewhat more predictable fashion. I'm pleased to say we get more questions from you. Thank you so much for all of you online to send us more. And here we have the audience asking if you could say something a little bit more about the issues of cybersecurity, climate change, particularly also the environment and the Arctic region, which is, of course, a bone of contention, and also a conflict in the Middle East. So perhaps we can distribute some of these more regional, but also the substantive areas to the speakers, to you, and see cybersecurity, the Arctic, and the Middle East region. Who wants to go first? Yes, Stephanie. Going first is good because you can choose.
Exactly. I can briefly talk, for example, I mean, I mentioned Syria already, right? So Russia is in support of the Assad regime, right? And hence had said that any kind of humanitarian aid coming into Syria should go through the Assad government. Now this corridor, this humanitarian corridor that the UN had established to move humanitarian goods into Syria is not going via the Assad regime. And so that's what I meant when I said that maybe they come to some kind of agreement, if not here in Geneva, then and in the middle of July at the UN. But an issue of contention is Russia wants humanitarian aid to go via the Assad regime, the US wants it to go via another corridor, and so that's something to be discussed. The last time the mandate was issued by the UN, Russia abstained from the vote, and so the potential of Russia abstaining again, I think, is pretty high, despite its preferences. When it comes to cybersecurity, I mean, here again, when we look at it from the US or the Russian perspective, I think we do have two opposing views. But we also have two very different actors when it comes to the cyber realm. And we have the US, who is the owner of most of the infrastructure, may it be the cable, may it be the technologies, may it be the tech giants. I mean, China is now catching up on this one, but definitely not Russia. And Russia, who does not want the cyberspace to become a space where foreign powers can interfere in the territorial integrity. I mean, Russia here again echoes always its debate, its insistence on territorial integrity and sovereignty, while of course actually intervening in other countries' sovereign space, and in that sense. But I think, Kazu, you mentioned already that there's some contradictions that together actually is our bundle of policies, right? And I think the Russian government is also a government who has specialized and has perfected pointing to hypocrisies of itself, but also of European counterparts. And so cybersecurity is, I think, another realm where this can be seen very much in the way they actually handle the attempt to govern the cyberspace at the moment going on at the UN, sponsored by two different processes.
Thank you so much. Who would like to take on another issue? Yes, please, Paul.
I'd be happy to say a few things about the Arctic and its link to climate change as well too. I mean, I don't know whether that is going to be a chapter that's will get a lot of space compared to the strategic issues of armaments and probably cybersecurity. But the Arctic and climate change are probably things that will need to be rediscussed in future summits as well too. Not least because, of course, the United States under Joe Biden has undergone this program of the Green New Deal, which was particularly insisted upon by the more liberal or progressive part of the Democratic Party. Has backed Joe Biden. And certainly there's been a lot of pressure indeed to increase the decarbonization of our economies. Now, up to a few years back, of course, the US was still quite a reluctant partner in this movement to decarbonize. It started to move in the other direction. The question is whether Russia and the Putin regime is getting on board that train too. And the fact is that the Russian economy still remains overwhelmingly dependent on its exports of fossil fuels. A lot of this actually relies on the very strong exploitation of the fields that are especially in the Russian far north, so in the Russian Arctic and in Siberia, a lot of virgin territory that is being turned over to oil and gas exploration. And in part, some of the claims that have been expressed not just beyond the continental shelf on the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean, but of course some important maritime claims that have extended to a good chunk of the Arctic Ocean have been formulated in the recent years. We wanted to draw parallels with China. Well, in some way, I suppose the United States is going to be anxious, and some of the other Asian powers that are also interested eventually in the development of a northeast passage route are not going to be too keen with the notion of the Russians turning the Arctic Ocean into what the South China Sea is from the Chinese perspective. So certainly, there's going to be perhaps an issue, and there it's not just for the US and Russia to resolve, because there's an Arctic Council and there are other Arctic powers involved, and so that is certainly one issue that will be discussed.
Excellent, thank you. We have a good 10 minutes left, and I'd like to also anchor the discussion back into Geneva. Because, of course, not just is this a place for summits, but also it is a place for many multilateral organizations that are dealing exactly with a lot of the issues that are part of the agenda. So do you think that bilateral summits such as this can also, perhaps also beyond the disarmament agenda, which we already discussed on, can it really unlock some of the multilateral issues that are home to Geneva, both with respect to digital governance, with respect to some of the climate change discussions, of which there are many environmental and climate change actors here in Geneva, and many special representatives on peace processes are based here. Perhaps, Kazu, can I throw this at you to start with? Where do you see opportunities for strengthened multilateralism after the summit from Geneva to the world?
Thank you for the question. Well, when it comes to cybersecurity or cyber governance, Russia's strategy has been to consistently push for the centralization of, or the, more emphasis on the International Telecommunication Union. The official position of Russia is that the West is obstructing multilateralism, that these technological companies should not be controlled by Western governments or Western private companies should come to Geneva, come to be discussed here as ITU. That is a multilateral forum, and that is Russia's official position. That has similarity to China, but also other developing countries pushing similar opinions and similar approaches. That's what Russia gets support. That when it comes to Africa, Latin America, Asia, many countries are also excluded from the governance of these private cyber security or cyber internet technological governance. Not excluded in the sense of, like getting rid of them, but just many of these governance takes place through European or American mechanisms. And so the Russia's strategy for now is to push for the more relevance for ITU. And in that sense, Geneva is certainly relevant, but I understand that there's a strong pushback from Western powers who want to keep it private. Like you said, most of the companies are still officially registered in the United States, the Silicon Valleys, and etc. So I do not think there will be a huge chance of success in bringing it to Geneva, but Russia is certainly interested in the centralization or centrality of ITU in that matter.
Thank you. John, can I bring you in on the discussion on the role of Geneva and the new multilateral agenda following to the summit?
I hope you can hear and see me without a problem, and that if there is, it's not the Russian hackers at work. But no, I think that in the future, everything is going to be much more multilateral. The problems that the world faces today are not those that can be resolved bilaterally. It's going to require multilateral approaches, multilateral solutions, particularly, as Kazu said, in the area of cyber governance, cybersecurity. We're in a situation where we have two competing visions of what the future of networking is going to be. Is it going to be a tool for the free exchange of ideas and information, or is it going to be a tool for governments to control the flow of ideas and information? How we address this point and how we resolve it is going to be one of the central questions of the next 10 to 20 years.
And surely here, given the global exposure, Geneva has a very important role, but it also needs to be connected to a lot of the other centers and capitals where this discussion is taking place. And perhaps here, Stephanie, I point to you. With respect to also perhaps a reflection on the way that multilateralism, and what levels of multilateralism Geneva can connect to, or the discussions. There are not just many institutions, but also many networks and other kind of actors that are working between the institutions. Is there a place for pushing some of the issues that come out of the Biden-Putin Summit forward in Geneva and to the world?
Thank you for putting me on the spot. No, so yeah, I think so. Maybe not only Geneva. I would mention a few more places where multilateralism is practiced on a regular basis. Because even when it comes to cyber, I completely agree with Kazu, but this is also happening in the UN in the first committee right now. So I mean, and that is New York. Yeah, I think Geneva. In that sense, maybe Geneva has an advantage of New York, no pun intended. But here really we have many, many issues that are covered by different international organizations, think tanks, that connect to issues that we talked about could be on the agenda in the Biden-Putin Summit. So this is, for example, health, and if the pandemic is being discussed, that of course also invites for reflections of how this can be translated into the WHO, but all its different kind of, by now, multi-stakeholder approaches that have been established around the WHO. But also, it can also maybe be an incentive to bridge different policy domains. So I mean, Achim, you and I, we have talked about this before, right? I mean, there are these different nexus issues, and there's a multitude of them. I mean, for example, UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, has a division that talks about how environmental degradation could, for example, impact different conflict areas. I mean, so there's a security environment nexus, there's a trade peace nexus, there's a health, security, and environment nexus. And I think Geneva, given that all of these issues are being addressed so far maybe more in still kind of siloed international organizations that are slowly moving into new issue areas, could also be a place that is opening up our thinking about these interrelated issues, and that there are by definition always implications in whatever we do in the field of security, in the field of environment, in the field of health, and the expertise is here. So that could be actually something that could be pushed for. It's not going to be, I don't think the Biden-Putin Summit will be the main trigger to do so, but it could contribute to maybe instill a few flames here and there.
But surely one might say that by looking at global politics through the lens of the Biden-Putin Summit, one can state that global politics has become much, much more complex with all of the nexus issues, with all of the new actors, not just governments, not just leaders, but also many civil society experts, social movements that all talk to each other, that are connected through the internet, and that are also part of finding the collective solution for, as you, John said, the solutions that no one can find a solution to but by his or herself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the end of this panel discussion. And we have done, one may say, a long walk in the garden in preparation of the Biden-Putin Summit. We have seen a world of global politics that is changing rapidly. We've looked in the past in order to see how some previous summits have evolved here in Geneva, how they were a child of their own time, in a sense. So also the Biden-Putin Summit is in itself a child of its time. And it was really a very useful moment to make sense of these different tendencies of global politics that we're facing today, and that are part of our daily lives for those who are working in diplomacy, for those who are studying diplomacy. and those who are commenting on diplomacy, like our excellent panelists here today. With this being said, thank you so much for your time and for your comments here today. This would be the moment when the audience gives a roaring applause. We just imagine that all of you in front of your screens, you are clapping with your hands, and you're waving to us, and you are giving your thanks to our outstanding panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, also thank you to your time, and also my particular thanks to the Geneva Centre for Security Policy for the collaboration of this panel discussion. Have a pleasant evening in Asia, have a pleasant morning in the Americas, and a good afternoon to all of you who are joining us in Europe. Goodbye.